I would be very, very surprised if Darnold's not the starter. I think they know that McCarthy's not ready, and I think everybody I talk to know McCarthy's not ready.
You're tuned in to the Ross Tucker Football Podcast, guiding your gridiron journey, none other than your host, former NFL lineman, Ross Tucker.
Oh, yeah, it is. But it's not just any Ross Tucker Football Podcast. It is a teaching tutorial Thursday, presented, of course, by DraftKings. That means my guy, Greg Cosell, the legend, the civilian GOAT, greatest of all time in terms of film watching, film breaking down. He's our guy here on a Thursday edition of the Ross Tucker Football Podcast. This is our last Ross Tucker Football Podcast of the week. We do 3 a week in the offseason, as you guys know. But you can always, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, even money betting podcast. Steve Fezzik had his games of the year. He picked 4 games of the year in the NFL. Even if you just listen to how he goes about picking those games, I think it's fascinating. Fantasy Feast with Joe Dolan and Tom Brawley was excellent yesterday. Not only did we give out 3 entries into our DraftKings best ball draft, but Tom is all over all of these spring reports. So any injury news, guys coming back from injury, anything that has to do with depth chart, there's some depth chart things out there that would surprise you this spring. And then Emery always crushing it with the College Draft Podcast as we're wrapping up our series there, breaking down every pick and his top undrafted free agent for every team. Let's dive into it. Don't want to wait anymore for Greg Cosell. It's Big Show time.
The Big Show.
Okay, Greg, I don't know that I've ever done this before, but I'm going to ask you about a baseball player before we get into the NFC North, because I know, you're a little older than me and you've been doing this a long time, so I know you followed baseball back in the day. I know you were a pretty good baseball player and basketball player. Willie Mays passed away this week.
Yeah.
And I feel like he's a transcendent enough athlete and that you have a good enough perspective that I just kind of want to hear your thoughts and memories or anything about Willie Mays.
Say hey kid. He was my favorite baseball player of all time. And I'll tell you a very quick story. So I'm 5 years old. I grew up in Queens in New York. So the New York Mets, for their first 2 years, they came into baseball in 1962. For their first 2 years, they played at the Polo Grounds, okay? Very famous venue. So in 1962, I'm 5 years old. I love Willie Mays because I grew up a baseball guy. I made my dad take me to the Polo Grounds when the Giants came in just to see Willie Mays. And because I was 5, of course, I said to my dad after like 4 innings, okay, we can go home now. But I made him take me just to see Willie Mays. He was my favorite player ever. And he was 93, so he wasn't going to live forever. But I was kind of saddened when I heard about it. It brought back a lot of memories.
I knew he was really good, Greg, but sometimes you don't really look at a guy's stats or whatever, or his career. 24-time All-Star. 24-time All-Star.
The guy was just ridiculously good. And he wasn't big. He was like 5'11", 185 pounds. I mean, he was he was so great. And just the way he played the game, so much enthusiasm.
It's funny. On some level, Greg, so back when he played baseball, baseball was by far the biggest sport.
By far.
Way bigger than football, way bigger than NBA and basketball. I guess I wonder if a guy like Willie Mays would play baseball in this era, like a really talented athlete like that. Would he play baseball, or would he try to be a point guard in the NBA or a DB in the NFL? Because just watching him run around, yeah. He was an athlete.
Well, you're right about that. In the 60s, the 2 biggest sports in America were baseball and boxing.
And horse racing, right?
Yeah, I wasn't into that, but you could be right.
It's unreal. All right, the other guy I wanted to ask you about, since he was in the news since last week's episode, T. Higgins signed his franchise tender with the Cincinnati Bengals, which means he'll be there on their team this year. He'll be there in training camp. We talked about this on Monday with Jason Fitzgerald from overthecap.com. I'm not entirely sure why he signed it already, but he did. Where's he at, Greg, when you think about the elite receivers? What is T. Higgins? Because obviously the Bengals feel like he's a valuable part of what they're trying to do this year, but it sounds like there's a decent chance, he might go elsewhere after this year.
Well, I could quote the Airplane movie when you said, "What is T. Higgins?" and I could say he's a wide receiver for the Bengals. But he's not in the group of the top 5 or 6 in the league, but he's a very good receiver. He's big, he's physical, he can run a bit. I mean, it was just a couple of years ago when he had the great year and then injuries hit that, some were starting to think that maybe he was in sort of that upper tier. You're certainly not going to compare him to Jefferson Chase, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, the A.J. Browns. He's not in that category. Not probably, he's not in that category. But he's, at his best, probably in the next category. Again, I don't get into the money. I don't know why he signed, why he didn't sign. But a healthy T. Higgins is a really good receiver. He's 6'3", 216 pounds. He's a big man who moves well.
Speaking of really good receivers, as we transition to the NFC North with our series previewing every division before training camp, the Bears, don't look now, they've got some really good receivers. I mean, feels like that's been an issue with them for years, and now you're looking at DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze.
Yeah. No, and all of a sudden, I mean, this is a team now, all of a sudden, that has a really good skilled group. Odunze's a rookie, but I expect he'll be a good player. He's a certain kind of player, and I think that he fits. Moore's pretty complete. And Keenan Allen, we know what he is. I mean, he's a slot receiver. He's a movement receiver. He runs great routes, short to intermediate. He's a quarterback's best friend on third down. They still have a solid tight end, too, in Cole Kmet. And a lot of people lost sight of the fact that they signed Gerald Everett, who still has some juice to him and can be used in certain packages. And obviously they signed DeAndre Swift. We'll see what this offense looks like. Don't forget, you have a rookie quarterback, and you'd never want a rookie quarterback if possible. And I don't think they'll be in this situation because, as you know, their defense over the last part of last season was among the top 5 defenses in the league. I don't think Caleb Williams will be in a situation where he's going to have to drop back 35, 40 times a game, and that will really help him acclimate. They'll be able to play much more proactively with him instead of reactively.
That is such a great point. Such a great point. Because you don't want to put rookie quarterbacks, really any quarterback, Greg, but rookie quarterbacks as much as possible. The more you can limit must-pass situations or obvious passing situations, the better, because they're going to throw the kitchen sink at him, and it's going to be some stuff he hasn't seen yet, and you don't want to put him in a position where the defense knows what's coming.
Yeah.
The more they can stay ahead of the game, stay ahead of the chains, I think the much better position Caleb Williams will be in. I don't think we talk about that enough when we evaluate quarterbacks in general or rookie quarterbacks in particular. Well, what was their situation? How often were they in obvious passing downs? And how often were they? Bryce Young was in obvious passing downs all the time last year for the Panthers. And that wasn't really the case with Stroud a lot. Stroud was able to do a lot of stuff off of play action.
It's too hard for a young quarterback. And don't forget, Shane Waldron is now the OC, comes from the Seahawks, but a Rams background. There's a lot in this offense to learn. Williams' head will be spinning, which most rookie quarterbacks are. That's the situation. So, and moving to their defense, because that really was the story a year ago, the last half of the season. Maybe it started when they got Montez Sweat. I don't remember the exact time it all started, but when they obviously traded for him. This is a really good defense. They've got 2 really good corners in Jalen Johnson and Tyreek Stevenson out of the University of Miami, who I loved, and he played really well as a rookie. Brisker's a good, solid safety. Kyler Gordon's an excellent slot corner. And obviously Edwards and Edmonds, 2 really solid linebackers. And the 2 rookie D tackles played very, very well, particularly Gervon Dexter. And then they also had Zach Pickens from South Carolina. So this is a really good defense. And you talk to people around the league, Matt Eberflus does a lot more than people might think. I think a lot of people think, he plays a lot of zone, he rushes 4. I mean, he'll do a lot of basic stuff on first and second down, but where you really study a defense, Ross, is on third down. That's where you see what a defense is.
Let's talk. You mentioned their defense. I think you're exactly right. We don't talk enough about the addition of Montez Sweat. I thought really put them over the top last year. I thought that was a huge differentiator when they brought him in. What about the Detroit Lions, Greg? I think everybody's sort of excited to see what they can do for an encore. I am stunned that Ben Johnson is still their offensive coordinator. Stunned.
Well, they're probably thrilled because that offense is really good. He has such a great feel for route concepts and spacing, and it's just every summer I watch their offense because they're fun to watch. And Jared Goff is a really good quarterback. I mean, Jared Goff, first of all, Jared Goff is 6'4". I think people lose sight of the fact he's a big guy. He throws the ball really well. A lot of people who listen to us hear me talk about defining things for the quarterback. They do a really, really good job of defining the reads and the throws for the quarterback. And that's Goff's game. He's a pocket quarterback, but he's a really, really good one. They've got a really good O-line, 2 really good tackles, really good inside. I think the guy everybody's waiting now to see, now that he's healthy and hopefully goes through an off season and a full season, is Jamison Williams, because that guy's got some serious, serious juice. We know about Amon-Ra St. Brown, just a really refined, subtle, nuanced player, as good in that regard as any receiver in the game.
Labatt Blue Lights are as good in the regard of going down my throat as any beer in the game. Absolutely delicious. I love drinking some Labatt Blue Lights with friends, living life to the power of we. Definitely going to have some of those this weekend. Always enjoy responsibly beer. Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York. You know, Greg, we've gotten to the point where if you don't make incredible second reaction plays and or have an absolute bazooka for an arm, there are people that don't think you're an elite quarterback.
No.
You think about any guy that, like a Jared Goff or a Kirk Cousins, or a lot of these guys, they're not going to get their props because they don't do things that wow the average person, right? Like they don't do Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes things, or even Lamar Jackson things. And that's, people want the highlight. We live in a highlight culture. And if the quarterback isn't the one generating the highlights, people are not going to push him into that top 10.
And you're 100% right. And, we've talked a lot about play action. They're a phenomenal play action team. Goff had more what I call conventional play action, meaning he's under center, more conventional play action dropbacks than any quarterback in the league, and they are so good at it. So good at it, because that really helps define the reads and the throws. And when you do it on 1st and 10, you are pretty certain as to what you're going to get from the defense. So you're attacking predictable fronts, I should say more predictable fronts and more predictable coverages. And they are really, really good with first down play action.
All right. What about defensively, Greg? Man, I don't think it could have worked out any better with them being able in the draft to get Terrion Arnold from Bama and Enos Rakestraw from Missouri, to be able to get both those guys in the first 2 rounds, because they struggled at corner.
Without question. And they signed Carlton Davis. So they really have improved at corner. Brian Branch is a big-time slot. The question is, will they also play him at safety in their base? He's just a really good football player. I thought Melon Fonwu, when he became a factor last year and started playing a lot at safety, essentially strong safety, he became a factor in their defense. It's a really good defense. I think Aiden Hutchinson, we've seen what he is. Jack Campbell was really good last year as a rookie linebacker. Your buddy Anzalone, he's just one of those really solid every down linebackers who seems to be getting better with age.
Let's move on to the Green Bay Packers. Speaking of age, Greg, they're so young. They're so young. And it's interesting in this era where everybody is trying to get these elite receivers, the Packers just keep drafting guys, and they're good. I mean, how about the rookie year that Jaden Reed and Dontavian
Yeah.
Wicks had last year.
And
Watson was banged up. I mean, and then they had the two rookie tight ends. I mean, I've never seen that before. Two rookie tight ends, two rookie receivers, and I think they're all good.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned Reed and Wicks because I spent a lot of time this week actually watching Jordan Love, who I thought improved so much as the year progressed. But the point I wanted to make about Reed and Wicks is Reed is I think those are the two receivers that stood out the most to me. They really started to expand Reed as the season progressed. He became a motion receiver for them as well as a slot receiver. He was their biggest third down target. I think he's a big factor. And Wicks, a couple of years ago, he had a great, I forget what year it was. It was either maybe 2022. He had a great year at Virginia. And then in 2023, 2021, he had a great year. In 2022, it kind of fell apart with their offense. But he is a big physical receiver, works between the numbers so well, has a pretty refined feel for settling into zones. Those two guys really stood out to me. And again, I'm not going to sit here and make a fantasy prediction in terms of numbers, but those were the two receivers that really stood out.
So interesting for them to take Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson in 22 and then come right back and take Jaden Reed and Dontavian Wicks in 23. They took Jordan Morgan in the first round on the offensive line. He's been moving around to several different spots. I'm going to be curious to see where he settles in. They played him at both guards and both tackles in camp. You don't see that very often, Greg, for a first-round pick playing four different spots in OTAs.
They ended up through the last half of last season, and it worked out okay, playing Rasheed Walker at left tackle and Zach Tom at right tackle. You probably are familiar with Walker. He's a Penn State kid. He was a big-time recruit. He was only a seventh-round pick, but he was a 3-year starter, I believe, at Penn State.
Yep.
And, they ended up playing those two guys at tackle, and it worked out okay. So they probably think Morgan, who I think does not have long arms, and I think that's why he's viewed as a guard. But he could well be the starter at maybe right guard if Jenkins stays at left guard. So we'll see how that all plays out.
What about the new defense under new coordinator Jeff Hafley, Greg? They made the change at D coordinator. They took guys like Javon Bullard, Edgerrin Cooper in the draft. Your thoughts on the Packers defensively?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what Jeff will do as far as his concepts and his approach. But they certainly look. Cooper can run. I mean, I would think they'd expect him to start. Now, again, with rookies, you never know, and there's a lot to learn for linebackers that are basically stacked players because there's a lot that they have to decipher and understand, so that can take time. But he was the most explosive athlete of the top linebackers coming out in this past draft. Bullard, in some ways, when I watched his Georgia tape, reminded me a lot of Brian Branch. Because Bullard 2 years ago was the slot corner at Georgia. This past year, he played safety. So he can do a lot of things. He sees things really well. You wouldn't say he's an elite athlete, but he's just, I hate to be cliched, but he's just one of those guys that's a really good football player.
Let's go to the Minnesota Vikings. Last but definitely not least, Greg, they got the deal done with Justin Jefferson. He's going to be there. I'm curious how you think it'll play out at quarterback with Sam Darnold and J.J. McCarthy.
I would be very, very surprised if Darnold's not the starter. I think they know that McCarthy's not ready. And I think everybody I talk to know McCarthy's not ready. I think their team's good enough too, Ross. You tell me your thoughts. I don't believe they're going to be one of those teams that starts out 1-6 and everybody's clamoring for the rookie. I think they're a good enough team that they're not going to be in that situation. And I'd be very, very surprised if Darnold was not the starting quarterback.
So talk to me about McCarthy not being ready. I mean, he started 3 years at Michigan, right? Like what's not ready about him?
Well, he's got a lot of work to do with his mechanics. He sort of had to work on his drop, his set. There's a lot to work on fundamentally and mechanically. He's a guy that actually has a strong arm, but doesn't play as if he has a strong arm because there's so many issues that have to be cleaned up. And I think Kevin O'Connell's really good at this kind of stuff, and they're working with him on that. Again, everything is always looks good when you're not playing in games and there's no pass rush there, and the pocket gets squeezed. But he has a lot to work on so he can play to what his traits are. He worked very hard to throw the ball when he was in Michigan, and there's issues that need to really be cleaned up.
That is interesting. Some people think you can, some people think you can't, right?
That remains to be seen. We don't, look, I can tell you right now, there were a lot of people that thought that gave him a third round grade. So I can tell you that for a fact.
Wow. What about defensively for the Vikings?
Oh, they're so much fun. Brian Flores last year, that defense is so much fun to watch. They essentially are a big nickel defense. Josh Metellus played something like 98% of their snaps. A fascinating thing they did last year, Ross, they had the most 3-man pass rushes in the league and the most 6-man pass rushes in the league. So they're a really difficult defense tactically to play against if they can get you in situations that are must pass. That's where they really, really are good and difficult to play against.
I love that. You know what? Because the more you do stuff like that, people aren't used to it. If you're doing the most of anything in the league, people don't see it as much. So it puts you in a really, really good spot. Greg, you're awesome. Fantastic stuff, especially there at the end on Darnold and the defense. Everything you said about the Vikings in particular was amazing. Really appreciate the time. Next week, NFC South. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Ross. Appreciate it.
Ducks Takes.
All right, Ross, we'll start the Lions. They signed UFL kicker Jake Bates, who's among at least 8 UFL players to get signed by an NFL team so far.
I think it might even be more than that now because it was yesterday or the day before that the UFL was touting that 8 guys had been signed. And I think I've seen a couple other guys get signed since then. So this makes me so happy on so many levels. First of all, I love that more guys are getting a chance to play professional football. I think it's like 50 grand, and they get a chance in the spring to continue to play the game they love and get money to do it. Phenomenal. And that they're getting this opportunity. Players get better. Players get worse. I'm glad these guys are getting a chance to show that they've improved their skills. They're better. And maybe they can make an NFL team or even just a practice squad. Practice squad's a lot of money now, man. Like, that would be huge for those guys. I love it.
And then meanwhile, Chiefs defensive lineman Xavier Buggs, he was arrested for a second time this offseason.
Yeah, I don't love this. I don't know what's going on with this guy. I'm not sure what's going on with the Chiefs. Do they now have multiple guys that have been arrested multiple times this offseason? Was Rashee Rice twice? It was 2 different incidents with Rashee Rice, now 2 different incidents with Xavier Buggs. I'm like amazed to be an NFL player. Didn't get in trouble at all. But they get in trouble the second time. It's like, dude, you're lucky they didn't get rid of you right away. Then you're going to do something else that gets you in trouble? It's not good.
And then we also have an email question here. This is from Scott Poth. He says, I've always been fascinated by the NFL snap count. He's asked if you could explain it. Is it the quarterback sound or is it timing? Can you explain it like a layman to me? I'll be listening for your answer. Thanks.
It's a really good question. That's from Scott Poth. By the way, I love doing email questions, so please take advantage of any of the sponsors you ever hear on the show or over at rosstucker.com, or just rate and review the show. Any question you've ever wanted to ask an NFL player, I will answer it. And hopefully we'll get to a bunch here in late June, July. There's not as much NFL news. We do have good guests. I thought Teron Armstead was awesome yesterday. Greg's obviously the GOAT, but we should be able to get to more of these. I would say it changes based on the team, Sam. It's funny because high school was like 128, right? It's funny. I remember I don't remember the college snap count at all. I'm trying to remember like NFL a little bit. I will say this: teams have like usually it's just a rhythmic thing, and it's like blue 80, hut. So if a quarterback comes up to the line and says he says in the huddle it's on first sound, he'll come up and he'll just go hut, and we're gone. That's first sound. If it's on 1, it's blue 80, blue 80. It's hut. If it's on 2, it's blue 80, blue 80. It's hut, hut. So you got to change it up, because if you don't change it up, the D lineman will kill you. That is your advantage, is switching up. It's mainly just first sound on 1, on 2, but there's different varieties we can get to. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit next week. Good question, Sam. I love it. I think we're done here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Ross Podcast. Make sure to also check out Even Money, Fantasy Feast, and College Draft, all on the DraftKings Network on Samsung TV Plus, YouTube, or subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
But I'm never done talking about myfrontpagestory.com. You guys know how I feel. I love love. I love telling people how you feel about them. Life's too short. Myfrontpagestory.com, the best way to do this. Also a fan of backofficeschedule.com, humanheadnyc.com, Sporticulture,